The ground beneath his boots was cracked and dry like the surface of a dead world where no life belonged, and no one sane would ever walk alone, yet here he was. Ale, the last scavenger wandering through the abandoned zones of Delta 6 Moon, looking for anything that could be sold or traded for survival. His oxygen levels were stable. His scanner beeped quietly in his hand, and his eyes scanned the fog-covered valley where ruins of a long-forgotten alien civilization stood tall like broken bones of a buried god. He moved carefully between jagged stone pillars and rusted metal shells of alien ships that had crashed here long ago. Some still radiated faint energy, but most were just empty ghosts. His mind was focused on fuel packs, food processors, rare parts, anything he could find, until he heard it, a sound so faint and strange that he paused mid-step, like a whisper through static like breath, scraping against gravel. At first he thought it was the wind, but then he heard it again. A low groan, sharp and weak and entirely out of place in this dead zone. He followed the sound slowly, his heart pounding, his grip tightening on the pulse knife clipped to his belt. And as he stepped around a collapsed wall, his eyes locked on something he never expected. She lay there, curled into herself, shivering like a dying flame. Her skin pale, almost silver, with a faint violet hue. Her arms wrapped around her stomach, as if trying to hold something broken inside her. Long black hair tangled across her face, her clothes torn, her legs scraped, and her bare feet dusty and bruised. Her body was thin, starved, barely holding on to life. But it was her eyes that froze him completely, not because they were open, but because they fluttered weakly, as if she sensed him. Her eyelids lifted, and underneath burned two deep red irises glowing faintly with hunger, pain, and something else. Something close to fear. He'd heard stories of her kind back in the outposts, stories told in hushed voices around fire pits at night about vampire-kin aliens who drank blood, who fought in the outer wars, who disappeared after their empire fell, and left only fear behind. No one ever saw one up close, not anymore, not unless it was too late. And now one of them lay in front of him, broken and starving so badly she looked more like a lost child than a monster. Her hand twitched slightly, reaching for nothing, then falling limp again, as if her body had nothing left to give her. Breathing was shallow, her chest barely moved, and for a long moment Eli just stood there, staring, unsure what to do. His instincts told him to turn away, leave now, disappear into the fog, and forget what he saw. She wasn't human. She wasn't his problem, and if anyone found out he had seen her and didn't report her, they would call him a traitor or worse. But something about the way she looked, the way her fingers curled into the dirt weakly, the way her lips parted without sound, as if trying to speak to someone before death took her, stopped him from moving. He stepped closer, carefully, slowly, crouched beside her, and reached out his gloved hand to feel for a pulse. Not that he even knew where her kind kept their hearts, but he needed to try. Her skin was cold, colder than any living thing should be, but under his fingers he felt a weak thrum, like the flicker of a dying star. She needed help, not just water or food, but blood, real nourishment, something that could pull her back from the edge. He didn't carry blood packs often, but he had found one sealed and still fresh in a down med unit the day before, and kept it in his pack, thinking it might be worth trade. Now he pulled it out, staring at the small red bag in his hand, knowing exactly what it meant to offer it to her. Eyes opened again, just barely, and this time she saw him, truly saw him. Her lips moved again, but no words came, only breath and desperation. Her gaze dropped to the blood pack, then lifted back to him with a silent question filled with shame and hunger and fear all at once. He tore the top open and brought it close, pressing the edge to her lips, and slowly tilted it, letting the liquid touch her tongue. At first, nothing happened. Then suddenly her body jerked, as if hit by a shock, and her eyes widened as her hands grabbed the pouch weakly, and she drank. Not like a beast, but like someone who had been dying for days and finally found hope. Her hands trembled, her breathing deepened, her shoulders stopped shaking slightly. Eli watched every second, his heart pounding, unsure if she would turn violent or mad, or even attack him once strength returned. But nothing like that happened when the pouch was empty. She let it fall from her fingers, her eyes locked on his again, This time they didn't glow with hunger or threat, they shimmered with something soft, almost like gratitude. She tried to speak again, but her voice was no more than a rasp, and then her body gave out completely, her head resting against his knee. As unconsciousness took her, he sat there frozen, his thoughts spiraling faster than he could stop them. What had he just done? What had he just invited into his life? He didn't even know her name or what she was capable of. All he knew was that she would have died if he hadn't stepped in, and now she was here breathing alive because of him. Eli looked at the horizon. The sky above choked in orange clouds and dust. He knew what this meant. Hiding her meant betraying every survival rule he lived by and every law written by the coalition. But somehow his mind kept returning to one simple truth. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't heard him. She hadn't even spoken, and still she looked more human in her brokenness than any of the soldiers who walked over corpses for power. He stood up slowly, lifting her carefully in his arms. She was light, too light, bones and skin, barely holding together, her face calm in sleep, her hands resting against his chest. He turned and began walking toward his shelter, buried deep inside the rock face where no one ever came. As he walked, he whispered low to her, even though she couldn't hear him. "Won't let you die, not like this, not alone." And the wind behind him carried no answer, only silence. As the last human and the last vampire girl vanished into the shadows of the ruined world, air inside the shelter was thick with heat, recycled and stale, yet safe, far from the eyes of patrol drones and the ears of scanners. Buried deep into the side of a broken canyon, Eli's shelter was nothing more than a forgotten maintenance hub, long since abandoned. Rusted wires hung from the ceiling, walls were cracked, and the floor was uneven. But it had power, it had water, and more importantly, it had silence and distance from the world above, where rules were made to protect some and condemn the rest. Laid her gently on the cot near the heater, her body still cold, but breathing now, her face pale, her lips slightly red from the blood pack she had taken earlier. Her skin seemed softer now, less tight over bone, as if her body was beginning to accept life again. Eli sat beside her, watching every rise and fall of her chest, the fear inside him still fresh, his mind filled with warnings about her kind, yet somehow all those warnings felt too distant compared to the girl lying unconscious in front of him. He didn't sleep that night, not because of danger, but because of thoughts racing through him. Too fast to stop, he kept thinking about the choice he had made out there in the ruins. No one had forced him. No one had even seen him. And yet he had made a decision that could cost him everything: his license, his freedom, maybe even his life. Harboring a hostile alien was a violation, punishable by exile or execution, depending on who found you first. And yet here he was, listening to the soft breathing of a vampire girl in his bed. Next morning came slowly, with a weak blue light creeping in through the cracks in the ceiling. She stirred, her fingers twitching before her eyes fluttered open. The red still there, but dimmer, less threatening, more tired than anything else. She looked at him, confused, unsure of where she was or who he might be. But when he offered her a small container of water, her hands moved to accept it, her movements careful and slow, as if she was afraid she might break something by trying too hard. He didn't speak for a long time, only watched as she drank only a few sips before stopping again. Her eyes met his, and she seemed to study him, not with suspicion, but with quiet curiosity, as if trying to understand why he had helped her, what he wanted in return. Eli only sat there, silent, arms folded across his chest, mind still spinning with what might come next. When she finally spoke, her voice was dry, cracked and soft, barely above a whisper, yet every word was clear. "I didn't mean to fall." Her words held no apology, just truth, simple and tired. Eli didn't respond at first, unsure of what to say, because how could he explain to her that he understood falling in a world like this wasn't just about weakness. Sometimes it was about running too long. Sometimes it was about being hunted without rest. Sometimes it was about being alive when everything else around you had already died. She asked where she was, and he told her the truth: a mining moon, forgotten by both sides, left behind after the war ended. He told her his name, and that he was a scavenger, nothing more, nothing less. and when she asked why he helped her, he had no answer. Not one he could explain, because something in her eyes, something in her pain had called to him, louder than fear, louder than reason. As the hours passed, she began to move more slowly and carefully, her strength returning bit by bit. Eli gave her another blood pack, the last one he had. She looked at it, hesitated, then shook her head, saying she would take only if he offered, not because she needed it, but because it would be his choice, not hers. That moment stayed with him longer than anything else. Her restraint, her silence, her awareness of what she was, and how others saw her. She wasn't a monster, and maybe she never had been. Maybe all those stories about her kind had forgotten to mention the ones like her, the ones who asked first, who suffered in silence rather than take what they could by force. But outside the shelter, the world kept moving, and trouble was never far from places like this. 2 days later, Eli's perimeter alert beeped, a soft light flashing on his comm panel, indicating a drone had passed too close to the canyon entrance. It hadn't spotted them, not yet, but it meant someone was searching, maybe not for him, maybe not for her, but someone was nearby and in a place like this. Curiosity was dangerous. He checked his old locator beacon, a standard emergency signal device required by all outpost scavengers, but the signal was active, pulsing slowly every few minutes, sending out his location to the Coalition's long-range systems, a safety net for some, a leash for others. If they followed it, they would find him, and if they searched him, they would find her. Eli stared at the beacon for a long moment, fingers hovering over the controls. Once he disabled it, there would be no calling for help, no rescue if he got injured, no signal if he got lost. It would be like cutting the last thread to safety, yet every second it stayed active was another risk, another chance that someone might come looking. He didn't ask for her opinion, he didn't tell her what he was doing. He just reached down, pulled the beacon from its cradle, and smashed it against the wall. One hard strike, then another, until the casing cracked and the light inside flickered once, then died. The silence that followed was heavy and final. She watched him, her eyes not wide, not shocked, just quiet understanding passing between them without words. He had chosen her over the law, over his own life, over everything he had built in this place. Next morning she sat beside him near the heater and spoke more freely. She told him her people had once walked among stars, had traded with humans, had danced in cities built from crystal and sound, until war tore it all down and left only fear behind. She had been a child when the bombing started, a fighter when the resistance broke, and a shadow when they scattered across the void. She had run ever since, drifting between systems, hunted by those who didn't care why the war had started or who had truly suffered. They only wanted to finish what others had begun. He listened and said little, but his eyes never left hers, not in judgment, not in fear, just in quiet acceptance of a truth too big to deny. She wasn't a threat, not anymore. She was just someone left behind too many times, and for the first time in years, she wasn't alone. Days passed slowly inside the shelter, with no light from the sun and no clock to measure time, only the soft hum of machines and the occasional drip of water from the pipe near the ceiling marked the hours. Eli worked in silence, repairing an old power coil, stripping wires from broken gear, checking his motion sensors again and again. While across the room she sat, watching him, her posture still, her eyes steady, the glow in them now softer, more like a flame than a storm, her strength returning, but not all at once. Did not ask for more blood, she did not complain or demand anything. Instead she listened. She watched, she learned every small thing he did, the way he sorted scrap by color, the way he muttered under his breath when a tool slipped, the way he paused before every bite of food, as if weighing the moment. She noticed everything and said little, only spoke when she had something real to say, and somehow her silence never felt cold. It felt respectful, like she was giving him space to make sense of her presence. He called her Nova, not because she told him her name, but because the first night she had whispered something in a language he did not understand, and the word had sounded like Nova. So he said it again to her, and she had looked at him with a softness in her face that made the name feel right, not a title, Not a label, just a sound that belonged. Nova began to move with more purpose. Now her legs no longer shook when she stood, her hands steadier as she helped him organize gear or sweep dust from the corners of the room. She had learned how to use his tools with surprising speed and even fixed one of the broken cooling vents without being asked. She was quiet but not absent, distant but not cold, and Eli found himself talking more each day, not just about supplies or systems, but about memories, small things from his past, stories about the Earth he left behind, the dog he once owned, the stars he used to watch as a child. He talked, and she listened, her eyes always fixed on his face, her attention full, like she was gathering pieces of him and holding them close. And then one night, she spoke a little more than usual. She told him about her planet, its green sky and black oceans, its twin moons that sang during eclipse season, its cities that rose like flowers of metal and light. She described how her kind had once lived with purpose, not hiding, not starving, not running. She said the war had changed everything, not just for her people, but for all of them. It was not just planets that burned, but the stories that shaped them, cultures erased, voices silenced, not because they were wrong, but because they were different. And Eli understood, not with logic but with something deeper, because he too had lost more than maps and homes. He had lost the trust he once had in the system that promised protection and delivered only survival. One evening, as they sat near the old heater, Nova grew quiet again, her eyes darker than before, and her fingers curled around her own wrist as if holding back something. And after a long pause, she asked him why he had helped her, not just at the ruins, but afterward, when he had every chance to walk away. When he had broken the beacon and sealed his fate, he did not answer right away. He looked at the floor, then at her, then at the heater with its soft glow, and said he didn't know. Maybe it was because he saw her fall, maybe because he had fallen once too, maybe because he was tired of being afraid, tired of believing everything different had to be dangerous. Maybe he had seen her pain and decided it mattered more than any loss. She nodded slowly, like she understood, and then did something he never expected. She leaned forward and held out her hand toward him, palm open, fingers relaxed, asking, not taking her eyes steady, as she said just one word, please. Eli felt his breath catch in his throat. He knew what she was asking, not food, not warmth, but trust. Deeper than anything else, she was asking to taste his blood, not in hunger, but in connection. A bond not forced, but chosen. And he stared at her hand for a long moment, before finally reaching out his own and placing it in hers. She brought his wrist close, but not to bite, not yet. She paused, waiting for him to nod, and when he did, she gently pressed her lips to his skin and drank. Only a single drop, no more. Then she let go, her hands pulling back, her eyes closing as if to savor something rare, not the taste but the meaning. In that moment, something shifted between them. Not just two beings in a shelter, but something closer, something that crossed species and war and silence, something born from pain and choice and the will to see the other without fear. But peace never lasted in places like this. And that night, as they sat beside the heater, a sharp beep broke through the stillness. The scanner near the door lit up, flashing red lines across the screen. Something was moving near the canyon edge, not an animal, not a storm, but a signal pattern known too well. Coalition drones sweeping the area, marking heat traces, narrowing in on outposts. Eli rushed to the panel and shut down all non-essential systems, reduced heat output, masked life signatures, but the scan had already passed once and might return soon. Nova stood beside him, silent, watching the screen, her eyes narrowing, not with fear but with focus. She knew what came next. They both did. She touched his arm lightly and said, if they found her, he had to run, leave her, take the passage under the east wall, and disappear before they captured him. But Eli shook his head before she finished. He had made his choice already, and it did not include leaving her behind. Outside, the wind howled through metal bones of the broken machines, and the shadows thickened across the valley as the sky above turned from orange to gray to black. And somewhere in the clouds, unseen by human eyes, the hunter's circle had begun to tighten. Darkness covered the canyon like a heavy blanket, hiding everything beneath its folds. The moon above remained still and distant, its pale glow barely reaching the floor of the valley inside the shelter. Eli moved fast, his hands pulling down old cables, shutting off power, rerouting backup energy to the escape tunnel he had not used in years. Wires sparked once, but he fixed them quickly. Nova stood beside the door, her eyes never leaving the small screen where red dots pulsed slowly, then faster with each sweep of the drone pattern. They were coming, not just machines but boots, soldiers trained to find what did not belong, soldiers who did not ask questions before pulling triggers. Eli grabbed his gear fast and silent, then handed Nova a sealed pack. She looked at it, then at him, her eyes asking what it was, and he told her emergency plasma stolen from a med station back when he still thought about credits more than survival. She took the pack carefully, her fingers brushing his for a second more than needed, then she stepped back as he opened the hatch in the floor. The tunnel below smelled of metal and dust, the walls narrow and damp, the air warm from hidden vents. They moved quickly, not speaking, only the sound of their boots echoing through the old mining shaft. Lights above flickered as motion sensors caught their steps. The exit was almost 3 clicks away, but they had done worse before. They had crossed poisoned lakes and broken bridges. They had escaped falling ceilings and collapsed tunnels. This was just another escape, another breath stolen from the jaws of the enemy. But this time it felt different. Every step felt heavier, like the world above was sinking its claws into them, refusing to let go. Eli glanced back once. Nova was still behind him, her eyes alert, her movement graceful. Even in this darkness, she had regained more strength than he expected, her body no longer trembling, her steps steady and fast. And when the wind behind them changed, when the tunnel groaned above them, she was the first to turn her head and whisper one word. Behind wall burst open behind them, a shockwave of heat and fire followed by metal legs scraping against stone. A drone had found the old entry and forced its way in, its scanner blinking fast, red light washing over the walls. It let out a high shriek, a signal not meant to warn but to summon others. Eli grabbed Nova's arm and pulled her forward faster through the narrow bend while the machine crawled behind them, sparks flying from its feet, each step digging into the tunnel floor. Eli dropped a charge behind them, not a bomb but a flash spark, enough to blind sensors for a few seconds. It worked. The drone paused and screamed again, a sound full of static and rage and hunger for order. They reached the lower shaft, climbed into the next layer of the old mining system, and kept moving. Nova ahead, now leading with instinct. She turned left, then down, then through a hatch sealed with age and rust. Eli followed without question, because somehow she knew this place better than he did, or maybe she simply knew how to survive. They reached the old rail system where carts once carried stone and metal from deep inside the moon. Now only rails remained, twisted and broken. They climbed onto a cart and pushed off using what momentum they had. The wheels groaned, but rolled down the slope faster with each second behind them. The sound of boots, now not just drones but soldiers' voices, low and sharp, guns ready, helmets glowing with night vision light. Eli looked back once, saw them rounding the corner, saw the gun rise, saw the flash, but the bullet missed, only chipped the wall behind his head. He ducked low. Nova reached out and pulled a lever. On the side of the rail junction, the cart shifted right, flying into a narrow line barely wide enough for its wheels. The soldiers lost sight for a moment, their voices growing louder with anger and surprise, but they could not fire without aim. The cart hit a dead end. They jumped before impact, rolled across the stone floor, and landed in silence. Nova stood first, helped Eli to his feet. He limped slightly. The fall had twisted his ankle, but nothing was broken. They kept moving. No time to stop, no time to rest. The soldiers were close, their signals stronger with each scan. The shuttle was only one level above, hidden behind the remains of an old docking bay, sealed and disguised. Ayla had kept it untouched for years, waiting for the moment he might need to leave forever. They reached the bay door. Nova scanned the panel with her eyes, adjusted the code pad with fast fingers. Eli punched in the old code 15900. It beeped twice and opened slowly, dust pouring out from the edges. The shuttle sat inside, old, but ready, small, but strong enough to break through low orbit and reach the void beyond. He moved toward the control pad, Nova behind him, closing the door as fast as it had opened, but it was too late. They had been seen. The panel behind them exploded, a storm of metal and heat as soldiers burst through, weapons raised, orders shouted. Eli turned, shielding Nova behind him, no weapon in his hand, only a voice calm and steady enough to carry weight. He told them to wait, told them she was not what they thought, told them she was not a threat. His words met with silence, broken by the hum of charging rifles. One step forward meant death, but still he moved. Nova stepped beside him, her body thin but firm, her eyes glowing with fire, not of rage but resolve. She raised her hands open, empty, her voice steady. As she said, she meant no harm and never had. Commander stepped forward, a tall man in black armor, face hidden, voice flat. He said she was enemy class. She was to be taken or terminated. Eli argued, not with shouts, but with truth. He told them what he had seen, how she had healed, not harmed. How she had refused to feed unless given, how she had fixed what was broken, not only in his shelter, but in him. The silence grew deeper, every soldier still, every barrel pointed at their hearts. Nova took one step forward, her hands still raised, her voice softer. Now she spoke in perfect human tongue, no accent, no hesitation. She told them her people once walked beside humans before war twisted history. She told them she had lost everything, her family, her home, her identity. She said she did not wish to fight, only to live and to remember what peace once felt like. And then she said, if they needed a prisoner, they should take her, but spare the human who saved her, because his heart was worth more than their laws. The soldiers hesitated, and in that breath, Ayla reached for his old Kung device, not to send a message, but to activate the link he had buried deep weeks ago, a signal he had left running under the surface, a live broadcast tied to a civilian channel, scattered and slow but real. It had recorded everything from the ruins to the blood pact to the drone escape, and now it reached ears far beyond the canyon. Voices from satellites and ships and stations and colonies saw the truth live unfiltered. The girl who asked the man who gave the law that broke before mercy. The commander's screen lit up, a voice from higher command, orders unclear. Hesitation rising, and in that one pause, Eli reached for Nova's hand, gripped it, and stepped toward the shuttle. They did not run. They did not hide. They simply walked past the circle of soldiers, now unsure of what justice meant in a world that had seen this much loss. And when the ramp of the shuttle closed behind them and the engines came to life, no shot was fired, only silence filled with questions heavier than bullets. And as the shuttle rose from the surface of the dead moon and broke into the sky above, the world below began to change just a little, just enough. Stars outside the shuttle window drifted slowly across the black sky like ancient ships sailing through endless ocean, and the silence inside the vessel was softer. Now not heavy with fear, but filled with a strange calm that Eli could not explain. His hands rested on the controls, while Nova sat beside him, her eyes watching the stars, as if trying to memorize their paths, her body still and quiet, her breath slow and steady, like the hum of the engine carrying them away from the world that had almost ended them both. They had escaped the canyon, they had escaped the soldiers, they had escaped judgment, if only for now, but the question of what came next hung in the air like static waiting to fall. Eli looked at her, his mind still circling the memory of her standing before the rifles. Her voice clear, her hands raised, her words cutting through hate like sunlight. Through fog she had faced death, not with claws or anger, but with grace and truth, and the world had watched and listened. The broadcast had reached further than he thought, not just colonies, not just satellites, but places where voices still mattered, places where people still remembered. That law without humanity was only silence dressed in steel. Messages had started to arrive through back channels, unsigned, encrypted, but real voices asking who they were, where they had come from, why they had risked everything for each other. And Eli had no answers, only a story that belonged to both of them. Nova moved toward the small storage pod near the rear of the ship and opened it slowly. Inside were old parts, emergency supplies, and a single folded blanket. She pulled it free and brought it back, placing it gently over Eli's shoulders without a word, then sat across from him, her eyes steady, not glowing now, just watching with the kind of quiet that felt like trust, not the loud kind that demanded to be seen, but the still kind that stayed when the noise faded. They did not speak for a long time. There was no need. The silence said enough. The pain they had carried, the fear they had faced, the choice they had made, all of it sat between them, not as weight, but as something shared. No longer his or hers, but theirs. Together, they had escaped not just a place, but a truth that had held them down for too long, and now they floated above it, watching the stars and waiting for what came next. Nova leaned back, her head resting against the wall, her hands folded in her lap, and then softly she spoke, her voice like wind across glass. She said she had dreamed once of flying through stars like this, but in her dream, she had always been alone. She said the stars had been cold and endless, and her hands had always been empty, and now here she was with someone beside her, someone who had chosen to stay, and for the first time the stars did not feel empty anymore. Eli listened without moving, his eyes still on the display, showing their slow drift toward a quiet zone far from patrol routes, far from signal lines, far from anyone who might care about what blood ran through her veins or what uniform he had once worn. They were heading toward nothing and everything, a place where they could be forgotten or found depending on who chose to believe their story. Asked her what she would do now, and she said she did not know. Maybe find others like her, maybe help those who still believed in something better, maybe build something small that did not need to be hidden. He asked if she wanted him to leave when they reached the next port, and she looked at him without blinking, then shook her head and said not unless he wanted to go. And he did not. He had walked alone long enough. They reached a station orbiting a quiet planet, once used for research, now left behind after funding collapsed. The station was empty, but the system still worked, the oxygen still flowed, and the panels still lit up with soft green light. Eli docked the shuttle and they stepped out into the silence of forgotten corridors. The air smelled of metal and memory, the walls lined with dust and old screens, blinking weakly as if surprised to see life again. They cleaned the rooms, brought power back to the main grid, activated water flow, and sealed off the broken wings of the station. It took days, maybe weeks. Time passed without measure, but they worked together, building something from what was left, turning rust into warmth and silence into shelter. Nova found a chamber once used for plant growth and brought it back to life with old seeds and new light. Eli repaired the antenna and reconnected the system to the distant edge of the web, careful to send only what they chose to share. Their story began to spread, not as headlines, not as orders, but as whispers between travelers. Signals passed between ships, old soldiers telling young ones about the human who saved the alien girl, about the vampire who chose mercy, about the place where they now lived, not hiding but waiting, not fighting but healing. And slowly others began to arrive. Not many, but enough. Broken people, hopeful people, strange people carrying pieces of stories, looking for something real. And Eli watched it happen, not with pride, but with quiet wonder. The place that had almost killed him now became home. The girl who had fallen in the dust now stood with light in her eyes and hands that healed more than machines. And in the quiet of a new morning, he stood with her on the outer deck, watching the stars again. The same stars that had once felt cold, now warm with the promise of something. Nova turned to him and asked if he regretted anything, and he shook his head, said only that he had never known what it meant to be human until he met someone who had every reason to hate him and chose not to. And she smiled, not with her lips, but with something softer, something deeper, and said, then maybe being human is not about blood or birth or bone. Maybe it is about the choice to care when no one is watching. Together they stood in the quiet above a world that did not know them and did not need to, because they had already found what mattered more Than survival, more than escape, more than safety, they had found each other, and in that truth, there was peace. He saved her life, and she gave him back his humanity, and between those two gifts, a future was born, not loud, not bright, but real, and it was enough. The end.